We're excited to have over 700 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 1 credit from the ACI. Let's get started by giving one lucky attendee a Webinar Wednesday lunch bag for answering this trivia question. Rigel, our sponsor today, is headquartered in Florida. Which city hosts a major NASCAR event every year? Answer now using the questions feature on your dashboard. While you're answering, I want to invite everyone to save the date for our MD Expo Fall Conference, which is October the 5th to the 7th, which will bring HTM professionals from across the nation to Seattle for 3 days of learning, networking, and the latest advances in technology, products, and services. Details can be found at mdexposhow.com/Seattle. Okay, and let's see who the winner of our Webinar Wednesday lunch bag is. It is Catherine White. Congratulations, Catherine. The correct answer is Daytona. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, Rigel Medical. Rigel Medical is a leading manufacturer of biomedical test equipment, including electrical safety analyzers, vital sign simulators, infusion pump analyzers, electrical surgical analyzers, and Medi-based asset management software. For more information, visit rigelmedical.com/USA. Our presenter today is Jack Barrett, National Business Development Manager at Rigel Medical. Jack, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Linda. Also, a big thank you to TechNation for providing us this opportunity this afternoon. And on the eve of HTM Week, a special thank you to all of you out there at Biomed Land, sharing some of your time with us this afternoon. Much appreciated. Thank you. So jumping into the presentation, just a quick overview on our topic. We're going to go through the background a little bit. Kind of the why safety testing is important. We're going to talk about the standards, different classifications from the manufacturing standard to what we call field standards. Also going to include some of the latest data from NFPA 99/2018. They do an update every 3 years, and the latest was just rolled out. Talk a little bit about testing and considerations, again, incorporating some of the latest news from NFPA, and then we'll close it off, hopefully right on time. So, as I kind of already said, I guess, we're going to talk about the various test criteria, various test standards, really, terminology. But by no way is this supposed to be a what you should be doing session. We're just going to be sharing some information, pros and cons, differences, some new changes. And but what you have to do is follow the processes established by your hospital, because whenever you get audited, that's typically what they pay special attention to. So we look at a medical product, whether it's, maybe as simple as a bed up to a ventilator or electrical surgical generator. There are various points in the life cycle, from R&D with some marketing input from the manufacturer going into production. And that's when they'll use manufacturing test standards, the IEC 60601, the AAMI equivalent of that, the ES 60601. That's when they'll go for their 510K through the FDA process. But the minute it shows up on the receiving dock through the point where it is decommissioned, it falls into your responsibility. And, as many have said before me, nowhere near enough credit is given for all you do. And again, with Biomed Week quickly approaching, it's HTM Week, I guess I should say more appropriately or correctly, a special thank you for all you do. So why do we do this safety testing? I mean, it's probably, it is the most common thing that you do on your daily activities. And really, it's just to be sure that that piece of equipment is electrically safe, will not prevent a shock hazard to either the patient or even just as importantly to the operator. So we talk about method of patient protection and method of operator protection. And it's all just to be sure that that piece of equipment, if you come in contact with it, you're not a conduit for electricity going to ground. So back in the 70s, focus started with this thing called micro shock hazard, and then also macro shock hazard. And what folks learned is that if current passes through the heart, you can go into a cardiac malfunction, fatal fibrillation, which all of that basically says is the heart is a muscle. It's supposed to be pumping blood and nutrients and oxygen through your veins to your extremities. And if that is not operating correctly, bad things happen and the patient can die, and actually rather quickly. Studies have shown that this can happen within 3 seconds. So this guy called Ralph Nader, political activist from Connecticut, the same home state as mine. In fact, he was born and raised about 10 miles from where I was born and raised. But anyway, in 1971, he wrote this article in the Ladies' Home Journal. Now, don't ask me at the end of this thing why it was published in the Ladies' Home Journal. I have no idea, except they were probably receptive to an article of this nature. You still can Google this article. It's an interesting read, but virtually it talks about the thousands of folks who died, virtually electrocuted, within hospitals each and every year. Ralph is probably more famous for his work in automobile safety. He authored a book called Unsafe at Any Speed that was the demise of the Chevrolet Corvair. So PM, preventative maintenance, we call it planned preventive maintenance because we do this on a cycle. It's a planned event. And the whole objective is to find potential problems before they surface, and start to look for potential problems before they surface. Visual inspection, always very important. Usually most of your issues will be found during this. But we look at line cord, power cord, ground continuity, installation, leakage current, performance testing. And then there's the whole issue of data capture and management. The standards do indicate the minimum amount of data capture or management. I shouldn't really say data capture there. They do indicate the minimum process that should be followed. But again, your hospital's process will be the overriding factor. Come on, computer, here we go. So electrical current, we talk about current flowing through the body. No surprise, electrical current requires a closed circuit. So there must be a path from a high potential to a low potential. And what we really try to do is minimize that path being the human body. Follows the path of least resistance. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get deeper into safety testing. And if you have addition of grounds in the system, how that can mess up your measurements. Can cause burns, it can cause injuries, death because of muscle stimulation. We already spoke of cardiac fibrillation in areas of the hospital where there's oxygen. It also can cause ignition. And the risk of electrical leakage current is always there. We want to be sure that it's a small enough amount where it's not going to trigger any issues. But if you do have an issue where you are in a cardiac malfunction, cardiac arrest, we do apply current through this device called a defibrillator, which puts a fair amount of current, 6 amps or so, through the heart muscle to hopefully shock it, pardon the fun there, but shock it back into what hopefully would become again a normal sinus rhythm. I'm always amazed when I look at this chart how little current it really takes to start to cause issues. So as you look at that, and we look and focus in on the area of 100 microamps, that's where we can start to see the impact of microshock. We can start working up the chart there at 1 milliamp. You can start to feel, sense electrical current going through your body. Only takes 10 milliamps for the let go threshold, and what that is all about at line frequency here in the States or even abroad, 60 hertz or 50 hertz, your muscle can respond to that, and it's called freezing on the wire, so to speak. So your muscles contract, and you can't let go of that device that's giving you the shock. And you always have to be careful if you come across a situation like that, because if you just simply kill the circuit, if there's any inductance in that circuit, you get the inductive kick that could have rather bad effects on the impact. And then around 200 milliamps, severe risk of macro shock. And we'll talk some differences between micro and macro shock. And then up at the 6 amp level, you see the defibrillation. Interesting that men and women have slightly different thresholds of what they can feel, sense, where the let go values are. So macro shock, electric current passing through the body, non-invasive between the skin and the electrical source. So we're not talking about current passing through the heart at this point with macro shock. And you can read the chart as well as I can. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can start to see where we talk about that 3-second rule down at the very beginning. Ventricular fibrillation, 500 milliamps for 3 seconds could finish you off. 100 milliamps AC. This is thanks to a gentleman by the name of Charles Dalziel, UC Berkeley guy, who looked and did a study. His information was shown to you in the previous slide, but talks about the frequency response. You see the 50, 60 hertz sitting there. As that frequency of current increases, the body becomes less stimulated by that. If you do any work with the physical therapy folks, you know that they will do electrical stim at frequencies of around 100, couple hundred hertz to stimulate the muscle within a body. And most importantly here, it shows resistances within the human body. The standard calls for all testing to be done with a 1 kilo ohm resistor to simulate the body resistance. So microshock, this is current going directly through the heart muscle, invasive shock, and 20 to 100 microamps of current can cause the ventricular fibrillation. So let's talk a little bit about leakage current. Probably the best and most simplest definition that one could ever have, leakage current, current that is not functional. I wish I came up with that. Anyway, it is unavoidable. Results of capacitance, resistance, and even inductive dielectrics within the device itself. As we said before, flows from a high potential to a low potential. The whole idea of manufacturing to a standard, the IEC or the AMI equivalent, ES 6601, go through the processes as to what the manufacturing process needs to have for electrical testing. And as you saw with the previous charts, it can certainly be hazardous if it's above the limits that we showed. And I'm not so sure about this bullet, easily overlooked or subject to incorrect testing. Can happen. If you're testing in an OR on an isolated supply, that would give you lower readings than what could be real. If you're testing something that might have an alternative ground connection, as we said, it's going to follow, current is going to follow the path of least resistance. So the current flowing through the 1K body model is going to be influenced by something with a less resistance path down to ground. So jumping into the standards and classifications. So manufacturing standards, again, IEC 6601, the AMI equivalent, ES 6601. And then we start talking about field standards, the IEC 62353, NFPA 99, identified as field standards because they're a little less stringent, a little less damaging. And when you say damaging, damage to the dielectric resistance of the product that is being tested, safety tested. We don't test high pot at 2 times line voltage plus 1,000 in these field standards. We don't test ground continuity at 25 amps in these field standards. We test at 200 milliamps. We have lots of data documentation testing that we have done, in fact, that shows if you test at 20 amps, you can have a stranded wire with most of the strands cut off. There's a few strands connected. You blast enough current through there, and it's going to show up as a good connection, when in reality, it is anything but. I mentioned 61010 because quite often it'll be touched on with electrical safety analyzers having this capability. And it's really more laboratory use than medical equipment use. So that's where that standard kind of falls in the scheme of things. So we talk about field standards. We again have the IEC 62353, which is very common in Europe. Germany, Australia have their VDE version, of course. UK, the DB 2006. USA is the NFPA 99, and that's what we're going to focus a lot of our commentary on this afternoon, because by far that is the most common test standard protocol used within the U.S. And as we'll see in a little bit, it can be dictated by law, but how well our governments work at times, or state governments work at times, it may reference a revision quite earlier than what the current one is. So we talk about equipment classifications, not to be confused with the FDA definitions of equipment classifications, much different. But in electrical safety testing, when we talk about a class 1 device, you can boil all of this down to it has a ground pin in the power cord, and we depend on that ground pin, that ground wire, to shunt any leakage current away from the medical device through ground. Class 2 is what we call double insulated, kind of a plastic box surrounding the metal chassis within the device itself. Concept here is you cannot really come in contact with anything that is conductive. Back when you had to do a lot of testing of this, folks would take their Kelvin cable, their test probe, and touch screws that might be showing, even though they were recessed and not easily accessible to the patient or to the operator, to be sure that there was no current or potential sitting on those screws. Some manufacturers would take copper foil and wipe it over the housing of the instrument to look for any potential leakage currents. But we'll see what the differences are that were introduced, I think, in 2015 with Class 2 classifications and the amount of testing that's required now from the NFPA standard. So when you look on the back end of any medical device, you'll see some symbols. And here are the symbols that define Class 1 versus Class 2 equipment. So it makes sense then that Class 1, since we rely on that ground pin, that ground conductor, that we use a little symbol for ground with a circle around it to identify a Class 1 piece of equipment. Class 2, I think I kind of used that in my description, a box within a box, and that outside box is plastic, non-conductive, so the risk of coming into contact with any potential voltage or path for current to flow is very much minimized. In fact, one might say eliminated. So there's a couple other symbols that you'll see on the back of things as well. The little human being there is a type B. And you'll see on each one of these, on the right-hand side, there's little paddles on each side of it, and that is what's called defibrillation proof. So we have type B, we have type BF, and we have type CF, body floating for BF, cardiac floating for CF. CF, of course, is the most concerning, the most stringent, because that represents the pathway through the heart muscle. So I'll give you a couple examples of each of those. A hospital bed is an easy one to identify as a body type. ECG modules are cardiac function. An infusion device, which initially I found kind of interesting, being classified as a CF as well. But when you think about the cantaloupe being inserted into the vein, there is then obviously a direct pathway to the heart muscle. For body floating, pulse ox, and paddle modules, BF. So we talked about 6601 a little bit earlier, being the design standard. Assures the safety of the patient and user. It first published in 1976. So we do electrical safety testing. We always talk about normal operating conditions and single fault conditions. Single faults are probably the more concerning of the two, because single fault basically means something went wrong within the device, and what is the increased risk of exposure to current flow. So 6601, we talk about a number of single fault conditions: opening the earth connector for contact, looking at what the increase in leakage current might be at that point, opening the neutral wire. That has been eliminated from NFPA 99, as probably most of you know, because that also causes the power cycling within the product being tested. And there has been a move certainly to eliminate power cycles during testing, as more and more equipment has computers associated to it. You go through the booting cycle, and we talk about reverse connection as well on 6601 as a fault condition. There are products out there today in medical use that if you reverse polarity, it could damage the piece of equipment. We talk about mains on applied parts, sometimes abbreviated as MAP, where we'll take line voltage. Spec actually says line voltage plus 10%, and put those on those patient connections and look at what the leakage current might be, and do all that testing as part of the manufacturing test standard 6601. Same thing applies to the AAMI standard ES 6601. Further, when we talk about applied part testing, applied part kind of equals patient connections, if you will. So in this case, an easy one to think of is EKG leads. So 6601, the specification, the standard states that each of those patient leads will be tested to ground individually, and then each will be tested lead to lead individually, and all of those tests will be repeated for every single fault condition identified. So here's the best reason why we don't do a lot of 6601 testing as a biomed, because you start talking about electrical safety testing here that could start to approach 20 minutes, if not exceed. Don't have time for that. So 62353. This standard kind of came about from thoughts looking at that 6601 test standard and saying, once a piece of medical equipment has been qualified, has gone through all the testing that we talked about in 6601, do we really need to duplicate all of those tests each and every time we do a PM within the facility? So the whole concept of field testing came up. It's not a 6601 replacement by any stretch of the imagination, but again, used for products that are located or used in the field today. And there's three versions of this, which sometimes can get a little confusing for folks: direct, alternative, and differential. Direct is probably best designed as the same way that we would do testing under 6601. Alternative says connect your hot and neutral wires coming into the unit and look at what the leakage current would be at lower voltages. And then differential is defined as pretty much, think of a current transformer on your hot wire, a current transformer on your neutral wire. The difference between those two, by definition, then, is leakage current. So a little simpler, easier, safer testing for you as a biomed doing some of those tests as opposed to direct, because when you're doing direct tests, you could come into contact with potentially dangerous potentials and leakage currents. NFPA 99, by far the most common here in the U.S. for hospital and ISOs and any other folks that have to do safety testing. It is dictated by law in many, many states. More than half of the states of the country dictate that NFPA 99 is the testing done. Chapter 10 is really the chapter that pertains to electrical safety testing. Chapter 6 can have a little bit of implication as it defines electrical systems. And again, 2018 is the latest, and there's a couple of changes here that actually cut down the number of tests that we have to accomplish. So I think it was 2015 version that they started talking about classifications of different areas within the facility. And the whole idea of classifications was to identify risk associated with that location in the hospital. For instance, if it was a wet location as opposed to, exam room, as opposed to maybe the morgue, And for each of those areas, deciding what the risk assessment was for maintenance. So 99 requires, and I think this is chapter 4 within the standard, requires healthcare facility to designate rooms within the facility as class 1, 2, 3, or 4. And if we dive into these a little bit further, class 1 makes a lot of sense. Here is where the risk is the highest. Think of a patient on the OR, not only is there body cavity exposed, but it's a wet location, and there's oxygen, and there's all kinds of things that can happen. So class category 1 are intensive care units, cath labs, ORs, ERs, critical care, cardiac care. Class 2, inpatient bedrooms, dialysis rooms, procedural rooms. Class 3, not likely to cause injury to the patients or caregivers, exam rooms, the dental offices. Class 4, category 4, I guess, labs, waiting rooms, the morgue. It's kind of late for things to happen there anyway. So those are your 4 categories. And then NFPA further says class 2, let me move this a little bit here, excuse me a moment. Class 2 double installation products on 2 connector cords and shall be rated as class 2 devices. And you're allowed to have class 2 equipment in the patient care facility. And further on, we'll see that they have applied further lenience as to patient equipment itself, or I should say equipment, patient-owned products like electric razors or computers or tablets, what have you. So there's a couple of types of equipment, if you will. We talk about fixed equipment within 99, and it is equipment that's hardwired into the mains or into the voltage source of the facility itself. Here's where we talked a little bit about point-to-point testing, because since it's not socket and plug, it's not the simplest thing to get in there and plug it into your safety analyzer. So we talk again about point-to-point. They have made further allowance on ground conductors here in fixed equipment, because the latest thinking, the theory, makes all kinds of sense, really, is that a ground wire is probably not going to get interrupted. And leakage current should not exceed 10 milliamps for fixed equipment. Portable equipment, more portable equipment certainly in the hospital than anything else. This is stuff that gets moved around, location to location, room to room, OR to OR, can be moved from location to location as necessary. And again, probably here is where we do most of our testing. So when we start jumping into this now, we're going to be looking primarily at the specifications for NFPA 99. We're going to do some comparisons to the other standards just to kind of give you a feeling as to what the differences are and maybe the thought process behind those differences. So to talk about ground resistance, this is the test that they would suggest you do first for good reason. But you take your Kelvin cable, your test lead, and connect the alligator clip to an exposed conductive surface on your piece of equipment, and you plug the plug into the device under test socket on your safety analyzer, and you do your resistance test. a little sample of actual connection. You can see the device under test being plugged into the back of the safety analyzer. You can see the little alligator clip test lead, down the cable, coming to the front of the device. So NFPA 99 will tell you that that resistance value has to be a half ohm or less. And it also will share with you that when you're doing that test, if it's a detachable cord, you want to wiggle it around at the point of entry to the device you're testing. You also want to wiggle around the cord as it enters the plug going into the safety analyzer to see if there's potentially any loose connections there. That's going to impact what that ground resistance is. So we say look at the comparisons. Again, NFPA 99 states a half ohm. During the manufacturing test, we talked about doing this at 0.3 ohms, being the pass-fail. Soft press behind this, and one thing you'll find if you do go out and purchase the 2018 version, they've added a lot more definitions, a lot more commentary within the articles as well. So it kind of gives you a little bit more definition as to what they're trying to share with you and some of the thought process behind that decision. Thought process here simply was that over the course of time, you can get a little corrosion, perhaps a little film resistance building up on your contacts, and that can have an impact as to what your ground resistance will be. Studies have shown that a half an ohm and below is still safe to count down that ground wire, being the protection for the device. And again, more common these days is to do this at a low current, 200 milliamps typically, as opposed to the 25 amps that was stated in the 6601 specification. Now, to talk about film resistance for a little bit, many times safety analyzers will have what we call a little zap circuit. So we charge up a capacitor so that when you take your Kelvin probe and touch it to the metal surface of the device you're testing, you can get a little spark, and all that spark is doing is kind of blowing off any film resistance that would impact your reading. If you do have a bad reading, it could be as simple as correction as, taking the plug going into the device, unplugging, plugging a couple of times to pair off any film resistance that might be sitting there. So what we always used to call chassis leakage is now commonly referred to as touch leakage current. The reason for that change was to try to remain consistent with the international standards, and certainly what has happened over the course of time is the standards have been trying to merge a little more closely together, so there's not large defining differences between one standard to another. So touch current kind of makes sense when you think about this in a definition: current flowing from the enclosure that is accessible to the operator or patient. And I guess you can't really have current flow until that operator or patient touches it, and then you have to bat the ground, which is what we don't like. And some differences here that I'll get to in a little bit as to the 2018 standard. We're always looking to try to minimize the amount of, or test for the amount of touch current available in chassis current that the operator or the patient can come in contact with. So we have defined conditions that we have to test in, and here's the big change, really, when you start talking about 2018, NFPA 99 2018. I had done a Google search. I did this presentation in California a bit ago, and we talked about conditions that you had to have to conduct the test. And at that point, I had Googled 2018 changes and saw changes in a number of chapters, but nothing in chapter 10. So my assumption was nothing had really changed all that much, but it has, and here's the change. So the measured touch current, again, what we used to call chassis current, we used to do 4 conditions: ground closed and power off, ground closed and power on, ground open and power off, ground open and power on. Ground open would be your single fault condition. NFPA 99 now tells you you only have to do your touch current test with an open ground. You don't have to do the duplicate test for the ground wire closed. I guess the thought process, the reasoning is, if it is intrinsically safe with a single fault condition, it is more than safe with normal operating conditions. So fixed equipment, again, equipment that is hardwired into the line voltages of the facility, and our allowable current here is 10 milliamps. AC or DC with all grounds listed. And again, for portable equipment, you can see where I've striked out some of the commentary. Touch current for cord connected equipment shall not exceed 500 microamps with the ground wire disconnected. So 2 steps in your safety testing that if you adopt, or the hospital adopts, NFPA 99 2018, that you no longer have to do. And as we all know, any time saved is time well used somewhere else. So just jumping into the test procedure here a little bit. We talked about the normal touch leakage, and then we talked about lead leakage tests. And the advantage here with NFPA 99, and the same is true for VIC 62353 as well, really, is in the 601, we talked about testing each EKG lead separately, or any patient touch point separately, and then lead to lead as well. With 99 and 62353, you tie all of those points together and you test at one point. And we want to be sure that we don't have more than 500 microamps for the ground wire open. We still have to do the ground open though. So I have a little bit of error in this slide. I just recognized that we don't want to see 100 microamps, more than 100 microamps with the ground closed. And I corrected myself again because this little addition there at the bottom, 10.2.6, says that it shall not exceed 500 microamps with normal polarity and the ground wire open. Now it's interesting, until you really stop and look at this, as we come down to the next slide, oops, not the next slide yet. Here we're still talking about pasting our patient leads all together. Ground closed, power on, ground open and power on. And here's the slide that I expected just a moment ago. Back early in the presentation, we talked about CSBF, type B and such. When you look at what the classifications for cardiac floating was 10 microamps per lead, 50 microamps, single fault condition. And, you know, we're saying at NFPA 89, 100, 500 microamps. But when you think, okay, 10 leads times 10 microamps, that gives you 100, 10 leads times your 50, that gives you your 500 microamps. So in effect, we are kind of testing at the same conditions for the same values. And just more of the same. This kind of just jumps more into the 6601. where we talk about that with 99, we do not have to do testing lead to lead, which is a terrific time saver. Isolation testing required under 6601. In fact, some of your newer analyzers will do isolation testing at 4 voltages, 50, 100, 250, 500. NFPA 99 does say now that you don't have to do any patient isolation testing as part of that standard. Here's a change that happened in 2015. No longer contains instructions for testing equipment with no exposed conductive surfaces. Ungrounded plastic encased devices intended for use in the patient's vicinity shall be visually inspected for damage and verify that it's labeled as double insulated. So that's pretty cool. Now, I guess what I would add to this is if you ever have to open up something and do repair on it, probably would still be a good idea just to verify that everything is copacetic. This again was a change introduced in 2015, non-patient care related equipment. So here's where we're talking about tablets and PCs and how some folks would get grumpy if they weren't allowed to use their device until it was electrically safety tested. Now the specification is pretty easy and simple. Shall be visually inspected by staff or other personnel. So if it looks good, doesn't have any cracks in the case, all the wiring, all the power cords, etc., are intact, you don't have to do any electrical safety testing. It is good for the patient to use in the patient environment. So visual inspection, pretty obvious here. You look at any of the service manual, the housing closure, decontamination, electrical connections, secondary ground connections. We'll touch about that in a moment. All the safety markings and labeling correct. Everything is looks good and up to date. So secondary ground, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and here's just a little visual. Think of maybe a stress test machine where you can have a cardiac monitor, you can have a treadmill, you have 9-pin D connectors, tying all this stuff together. And we say current will take the path of least resistance. And I didn't highlight it on my slide when I was talking about ground continuity testing. I'm always a little suspect of looking at a piece of equipment when I get a 0 reading. 0 is a great number, but in reality, not the most common. So what we show here is a little diagram, two resistors in parallel, one being a 1 ohm resistor, the other being the 1K body model, and most of your current is going to flow through that second earth connection. Very little current will flow through the 1K body model, which just says then that perhaps you're doing a test and your result is inaccurate. Fortunately, safety analyzers, well, some, I'm not saying whose, but we are sponsoring this webinar. Anyway, safety analyzers will come up and give you a message to check for a secondary ground condition to make sure that you're getting a good accurate reading. So inspecting power cords, broken bent pins, all this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. You know it better than I do. Color codes on US, hot, white, green for ground, international, isolated power sources. One comment on isolated power sources, NFPA 99 does now go into a great deal of discussion that you should not do your electrical safety testing on an isolated power source. You should be doing it on what's called a thermoneutral, or a power source that does have one leg of the power system to ground. In the US, that would be the white wire. So there's two things you can do. You can run a long extension cord if you want to test do electrical safety testing in a area like an OR, where you would have isolated power sources, and just to be sure that you're getting accurate readings, because off an isolation transformer, you're not going to get accurate readings for ground resistance, clearly, or for potential touch current. Test process on paragraph 10.5.2 in 2012 removed the previous required 12 and 6-month testing intervals. Now testing is required before being put into service for the first time or following any repair or modification that might compromise electrical safety. So data on reporting, paper-based or electronic, there's all kinds of options out there in the marketplace to do either. If you do capture data, you can do trending, do comparisons. NFPA 99 does now give the minimum acceptable things that should be collected, which are basically what with a unique device identifier, when, and at a minimum, whether it passed or failed. So closing up here, almost running right on time, that's all. So here is a little clip I took from where you can order your NFPA 99 standard. The PDF of the handbook, $160 or $165, really well worth it. Link on the bottom there will get you to it. But if you just Google NFPA 99 2018, you'll get to this page as well. Amy, a couple of years back, 3 years back now, I guess, by looking at the date, did a manual on electrical safety, where they also went through and did a lot of the comparisons between the standards. We talked about NFPA 2015 at that point in time. That document was sponsored by Rigel Medical, and it is still available for sale as well through the AAMI website. We produce a guide to 62353, which doesn't really just talk about the 62353 standard, but talks to fairly good detail as the thought process that was behind the standard, the differences. It goes certainly into a whole lot more detail than what I went into as far as the differences between direct, differential, and alternative testing. As much detail as you probably can stomach. There's also a decent book that you can purchase from Amazon, Medical Devices Use and Safety. I took this link a little bit ago, so I wouldn't be surprised if the price is a little bit higher now, but a very good read as well. And at this point, I'm going to open up to questions. I do want to give a little plug for Meta. Meta is a national organization of biomed, not certainly to compete with a local chapter that you may be involved with. If you don't have a local chapter available to you or not convenient to you, Meta is a good resource. And as we speak, registration and joining Meta is free of charge. So my contact information is listed there, my cell phone number, my email address, and we'll kick it off with some questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. Yeah, as time is getting on, we have time for just a few questions. Could you just recap what the major changes in the 2018 edition are?
Yeah, certainly. There's two that really impact biomeds, which is Chapter 10. Doing a touch leakage with single fault condition is the only way you have to test now. You don't have to test in normal operating condition, which would be the ground wire connected. So that's the big change. There's also a fair amount of commentary added on relocatable power taps, which is also a very interesting discussion. But for Chapter 10, for biomeds, those were those two major changes.
Okay, that's great. Now you discussed Class 1 and Class 2. What does Class 3 refer to?
NFPA 99 doesn't talk about Class 3. They do talk now in 2018 about testing at the voltage the product is being designed for, which makes a lot of sense for 120 volt operation. Class 3, you'll start to see it pop up in some different journals and such, and it really just refers to low voltage DC operated product.
Okay, that's great. But what is the procedure to be followed in the event that a device fails the electrical safety?
Well, I guess it depends as to which part fails. If it was ground continuity, might want to try replacing the line cord. If it was detachable, if it's leakage currents and such, 99 2018 now gives you a couple of suggestions as to adding a small isolation transformer, adding an additional ground connection, just trying to alleviate the issue.
Okay, a good question from a lady biomed who said the data provided for electric shock current for man and woman is based on which country?
That was done by a gentleman out of University of California, Berkeley. So that was done here in the U.S.
Great. Okay, then. Well, as we are now coming up to our hour, I just want to say to attendees that questions we didn't get time to ask, I will be sending to Jack, so he will answer in the near future. Just want to thank you, Jack, again for a great webinar, and to thank you again to today's sponsors, Rival Medical. One lucky attendee will win an Amazon gift card for completing the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. You must complete the survey to obtain your certificate of attendance. If you do not see the survey, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. For more information about our upcoming webinars, please visit our website, webinarwednesday.live. Thank you once again for everybody attending today. Have a great day, and we hope to see you again next week.